This is an opportunity I think that I've looked forward to probably since I was in the lettuce and spinach fields myself, because in my experience back in Routt County, after I've been away for a number of years and returned, I would mention something about lettuce and spinach in South Routt County and talk about trapper siding and Toponis and Yampa. Now some people did know where Yampa and Toponis were, but the word that no one knew, or if you did, was trappers. So those three entities, Yampa, trappers, and Toponis, in South Routt are the source of the history that I have to tell you about today. Of course, there was lettuce and spinach being produced in other parts of Colorado at that time. But as you would see in some of the literature that I've been able to review, Yampa seemed to have the name nationwide for head lettuce in that era. And so what I would like to do is to review with you some of my experiences and some of the research that I've done on the lettuce and spinach business in South Routt. I want to also include the important production of ice that went on commercially in the county. Now, of course, during the early years, most ranchers had their own source of ice that they harvested for their own use and also for business in the communities. And then I will comment a little bit on my own family, because my own family, aside from the Browners in the Yampa area and Jack Hogan in the Toponis area, my family, and I give credit to my father mainly, produced probably the most lettuce and spinach that was produced in South Routt during the 40s and 50s, which is the era that I know most about. I have researched back to find out a little bit about why did they come to Routt County? Why was lettuce and spinach all at once? And it's my perception of the whole area and history of Routt County that lettuce and spinach production in South Routt County was the big boom that this area saw, or this part of northwest Colorado saw, previous to oil in more the western part of the county, or in the skiing industry that has evolved in more recent years. The question always comes, well, why did lettuce and spinach? Why was it raised here and not someplace else? Which of course it was other places, but the conditions that we had in the Yampa area, and I'll use that to extend over a considerable part of the county. The railroad had come into this part of Routt County in the early 1900s. The railroad was there, and of course, in order to ship any type of produce or livestock, the railroad was important. It's interesting to me that some of the people in the early production of lettuce and spinach packed it up into crates and sent it on the railroad by express to wherever they were sending it. The ice was here as far as the small production of ice was concerned when the first packages were put together, and labor was here because there were many families with a lot of children around that helped also. The other thing that was needed, which came more in later years, was a source of power to get into mechanical production. That's just kind of an overview of that part of it. But the altitude, soil, and climate were the combined things that we had here. It was considered by some of the California dealers that came through at the beginning of the production of lettuce that it was considered to be the ideal elevation, around 8,000 elevation. The cool nights, which tended to make the lettuce crisper than some of the other climates, and the cool night temperature that went along with that. They did try, apparently, and I'm assuming that I have not found this information at this point, but I would like to research it further, that Colorado A&M, as it was called then, or Colorado State University, did quite a promotion in terms of agricultural products after World War I. The first carload of head lettuce was shipped out of Colorado, I don't know where, but was shipped out in 1918, which would fall into getting into this era that came along then after World War I. 1920 was the first acre of lettuce was planted in the Yampa area, right on the edge of the town, by someone called Finley Stream. I have no idea who, where, or what. But it said that he carefully cut 400 crates of head lettuce and shipped it express by rail to, I'm assuming, Denver. He cleared about $3 per crate, $1,200 approximately off of that 1 acre of head lettuce. It was a gold mine to all these people that were wondering, what's that crazy man doing out there? Lettuce. That began, but I really feel that there had been some promotion done education-wise throughout the state, because in 1922, Yampa was the 3rd busiest lettuce shipping area in the state. Buena Vista ranked 1st and Florence 2nd. So for these other communities to be going into producing lettuce, there had to have been some statewide through the Department of Agriculture or the college. Interestingly enough to me is noticing where lettuce has been raised, and I frequently have occasion to go into the south part of Colorado, and going over the passes to Leadville, I've often stopped at and looked out on the area at what they call Pando, which is where Camp Hale was during World War II. And when one reads the signs that are on the description of the area, they call attention to the fact that lettuce was shipped from there, because of course the railroad ran right past there to Leadville and on south. So lettuce was produced in many areas, but many of the articles, information that I've been able to find on the Yampa area has featured it as being the lettuce Yampa leads in head lettuce industry. This was 1924 that this article was produced. So in 1921 then, and this is another interesting story to me, at the suggestion of Thomas Tynan, who was the warden of the penitentiary at Canyon City, 2 brothers were sent, or came from the Canyon City area to Yampa to plant 10 acres of lettuce on Tynan's property in the Yampa area. He owned, as well as being warden of the penitentiary, he owned properties around the Yampa area. Those 2 brothers shipped out 3 carloads. So when they say carloads now, we're getting into the actual, I'm assuming, railroad refrigerator cars. Anyway, they shipped 3 carloads and netted almost $3,000 for their 3 acres of lettuce. So this kind of production in an era of, I tried to catch up with CJ and have him do some figures for me on what some of these dollars would be worth in comparing to today's dollar, but I didn't quite have the time to get some of these things done. But $3,000 off, that's $1,000 an acre. And that's, would have been unbelievable to people to realize that at that time. So the next year, lettuce package heads began appearing all along the railroad. Yampa shipped 113 cars the next year. They shipped 3 the year before. They shipped 113. 1923 seems to be a very busy year. The Yampa area had 521 acres of lettuce planted. Some of us that live around the area wonder where those 521 acres were. But one of the things that I know from having been a youngster that came much later than that to South Routt County is that people were raising lettuce and spinach on just small acreages around. So we spread it out through some of the little creek beds and areas that we have throughout the county. That's because the acreage did increase even beyond that. This in 1923, and I'm not going to to relate this type of information on every year, but there were, as I say, Yampa had 521 acres and sent 192 cars of lettuce. Milner sent 1, Steamboat Springs 11, Oak Creek 21, Radium 25, Trappers, again Trapper siding 26, Topona 16, Granby 149, Tabernash 25, and 1 from Fraser. There's also reference a little later to some from Kremlin. So it was amazing how fast the interest in raising head lettuce spread throughout not only our particular valley, but all of the area. The growers in supposedly the Yampa, Toponas, the whole area through there, was $250,000 that particular year. And a quote in one of the Yampa papers said that returns will increase as growers become more familiar with the proper methods of growing and marketing their lettuce. Well, the marketing side of it is what has been interesting to me, is how the growers, how did they know where or how to market their product? What was the outsource for their products? In 1923, at the promotion of what was called the Yampa Commerce Club, and I would compare that to probably our South Routt Economic Development Group now, but they did the promotion and searched out a lot of information. And the Yampa Valley Lettuce Association was formed in Yampa. Later on, Steamboat, even Elk River, according to some of its history, and the Granby, Kremlin area sought out information from the Yampa Valley Lettuce Association on how they got organized and how they proceeded from in developing their export. One of the who was secretary of this organization put a great emphasis to all the people on don't attempt to sell an inferior product. Yampa must have a good reputation to attract buyers, and which indicated apparently that some of them were paying that close attention. In 1924, this lettuce association signed a contract with what was known as the American Fruit Growers Incorporated. Their headquarters, I think, were in California at that time. Working under the Cooperative Marketing Act of Colorado was how their contract was set up. The selling branch of that organization was the largest in the country, and that group was in touch daily with a long list of regular customers throughout the country to whom they supplied fruit and vegetables. So that's one phase of how the marketing began, at least, is working through a contract with a company who then had contacts all over the United States. More lettuce sheds were built that year. At one time, I think there were 6 in Yampa, and of course Trappers had one, Toponas had several, and as well as Oak Creek had a packing shed, others in the area. I'm just going to ask you at this time, how many in here know where Trapper siding is sometimes called? A few of you do. You have to look a little close to find where Trapper's siding was, or where it is still today. It's about halfway, just beyond Finger Rock, when you're going on 131. On the left-hand side of the road, there still exists a relic, which I'll come to eventually, of the lettuce and spinach days. And so it's approximately about halfway through. At the time of the lettuce and spinach business, there were about 20 growers in the Trappers area, which is interesting to me because, again, I know that area very well, where all these 20 men would have come from, right in the Trappers area to get together. But they met because they wanted a packing shed at Trappers in order to handle, and they had 160 acres in that area that they were expecting to raise lettuce on. So that's where that particular And later on, it was Crowners who also had the packing shed, maybe the original one, at Trappers, at least, for part of their career there. Publicity, and I'm going back again to 1924, a lot of publicity was put out for the Yampa lettuce. One of the quotes I have is, "It is on the menu at the Waldorf Astoria and other big hotels of the country and brings the highest price on the market. It has achieved its proud reputation in a few years." This is 24. 1920 was the first year that any was grown there. "And will continue to grow in popularity as the industry continues to grow in volume, bringing prosperity to a vast section of the country." Most of you probably know Sam Haslam. He gave me a call the other day to tell me that he had an uncle who was the head buyer for a big cafeteria chain, Myers Green, in Kansas City. And they featured Yampa lettuce on their menus. And this uncle of Sam's visited the packing sheds around Yampa whenever he was in northwest Colorado. Yampa lettuce received a lot of promotion in the advertising by the Denver and Salt Lake Railroad when they were promoting construction of the Moffett Tunnel. Only 14 hours to Denver with the tunnel. So that was one of the things that had to be done as far as the refrigerated cars on the railroad was that they had to estimate approximately how many they would need from year to year, because they worked through Union Pacific was the source of their refrigerated cars. And those had to be ordered in order to be sure that they had enough to ship out. I'm going to divert a little from lettuce and spinach at this time to talk about ice, because with the rapid growth of production of lettuce and packing in the South Routt area, the source of ice was a real concern. They were, after the first year or so, shipping ice in from Espy Ice Company in Denver in order to pack. And I will go into a little bit about the packing a little later, but the Espy Ice Company was very experienced in shipping ice, apparently many places. They had a big ice house and pond at Rawlinsville, which is the other end of the Moffett Tunnel, and I'm not exactly sure which came first. But in 1924, Mr. Espy, as I always called him, not what other people did, but anyway, Mr. Espy was in the Yampa area in June looking for a location for an ice harvesting location. He considered the site at Trappers as being the most favorable. So that's why I come back again to Trappers siting. The ice house and the packing plant went in there at approximately the same time, and the railroad put in a spur on there. They could put their refrigerated cars on in order to. And so Trappers siting, how it came with the name of Trappers to begin with is another story, but that was done in 1924. And in quotes it says, "It will mean an investment of $15,000 to $25,000 to build this ice house." Somewhere here. Yes, here. I have pictures. Some of, if you were around Routt County, like I know Jack and some of them were, will remember the ice houses that were at Trappers. Huge buildings. 36 foot wide and 120 feet long. There were 3 of them. I'm sorry I wish I had a video that I could show here today. Eventually we'll be having some of those things. But they were enormous buildings, and in 1920s, these were apparently first built. The first 2 must have been built in 25, because we have a news article that says in 26 an addition was built on. So there were 3 of those large ice houses built there, so that the ice did not have to be shipped in any longer from Denver for packing used in the packing sheds. The ice as such in the refrigerated cars, and I'll touch on some of how this was done a little later. Those cars of ice were again cars of lettuce were again iced in Denver by Espy Ice Company. So it was a big business as far as the lettuce and produce in general was concerned. Another thing that was very important in that particular time was the wooden crates that the lettuce and the spinach were packed in at the packing houses. And those had to be, they had to know in advance about how many acres of lettuce and spinach was going to be around so that they could have on hand the crates that were needed. Now I have what I want to read, and thanks Rita for the help you've given me on this. I have from Frances Moore, who some of you may know, or certainly you know Rita, his daughter. My first job with the lettuce, he says, was as a crate knocker, as they were known. I nailed the shook. That's the bundles of pieces of wood. Talked about a carload of shook coming in. It was the pieces that were cut for the lettuce crates. Ends were there, the sides. But this was later on, I think, as far as ends. He was probably doing the whole crate. Bundles of pieces of wood cut to size for the finished crates. Each evening after school and on Saturdays and Sundays, and he's named several people, young men, I would assume, boys that worked with him, we hammered crates together for John Cole. I nailed the ends while the two other boys nailed the sides and the bottom. I got 1 cent for each end. Carrie and Arthur got 3 cents each for their part. 5 cents for the finished crate. On a good day, we could knock together 200 crates. $10, big money, as a man's wages at the time was $1 a day. Wow. And the crate making was really a very important part of this whole production because and again, I think probably from Rita I have the information about how there was a sawmill beside of Yampa that tried to saw so that they could make the crates locally and ran into problems, especially when they changed the size of crate that they wanted because equipment would have had been changed. But likewise, it was less expensive to ship in the material that was needed to build the crates. So crate making was another source of jobs for the local people. In 1925, Yampa had 1,500 acres of lettuce and shipped 469 carloads, received about $500,000 in that year, about $300 per acre. Unbelievable money. About 3,000 acres of lettuce was grown from Oak Creek to McCoy, so it was an extensive area. Lettuce growing by 1925 had become big business. It was at that time, in 1925, that a news clipping we have says that all farmers are cordially invited to attend the annual meeting of the vegetable growers at the college farm at Avon. Now everyone knows where Avon is. Can you imagine that there was a college farm there that specialized in vegetable crops or produce? Anyway, that college president, Charles Laurie, was to speak at that particular meeting. I'm just going to briefly hit on a couple more references to the years because things did change. In 1926, they figured from Steamboat to Granby there were 5,000 acres of head lettuce. That's a lot of head lettuce. 1927, and this is quoting again, packing sheds extended from Yampa to Finger Rock along the railroad tracks. Different people, by that time there were some of the more commercial companies coming in and developing a packing shed. East Indian Hindus came to the area and raised small patches of lettuce. Japanese and other nationalities from the Oak Creek mines raised lettuce in the summertime as additional. When these East Indian Hindus, and all I've heard is just stories related to their being in the area. I don't think they were there for very long, but they all wore the big turbans and caused a lot of attention wherever they went. Now, someone was telling me that, and most of the Hindus are very tall men, that there were little huts that were built on the sides of some of the hills that apparently they could just crawl into and sleep, and that was the way in which they... There were also buildings that were still, when I first remember this area, that were called jack shacks. Not a very dignified term for them, but that's what they were called, where some of the people came in, and the Japanese came in and lived and put out small acreages, because now, backing up to the 1920s to look at how they raised lettuce and spinach, that was before tractors and machinery. This was a horse era, and much of the lettuce was planted with single-row planters in these small fields that were pushed, as some people still do, and I've done, in gardens for planting. It was planted in, and likewise then the harvesting. And we do have some pictures, and again, I wish I had them enlarged and or had them on a screen, but showing the wagons with a team of horses and the lettuce crates being harvested in the field and set onto the wagons, and then the wagon load. In fact, my husband tells about how his uncle came and raised lettuce on the ranch that I live on, and used horses then to haul from, which is about 8 miles, haul the lettuce into Yampa to the shed with the team of horses and the wagon. This is how we have to look at what was done during the, actually up until almost after World War II, was still the horse era in Routt County. And I know Vernon, we could have some real stories on some of these horse activities that went on, from runaways to whatever. 5,000 acres, packing sheds, yes. There was a strong market in 1929, 20 to 25 cars per day from Yampa. Again, I'm one of these researchers that questions a little bit some of the information that we run onto, but it was still going great guns when the stock market crash hit. The 30s I can find, and if anybody finds anything in the 1930s relative to lettuce and spinach, I would like to know about it, because I think the whole area was hit like the whole country was through the Depression years, as far as really lettuce and spinach in the South Routt area did continue in some during that time. However, a lot of people in the area did leave too during that time, because a lot of these small farming, ranching operations were just not economical. And so there were, the 30s had its effect in Routt County as it did in other places. 1940 to 1950, most of that era, and that's the era that I'm most familiar with, row crops boomed again. Part of that was because of World War II, unfortunately. It seems like things like that do have an effect. I'm going to skip a little bit on some of this information and go into a little bit more of the production of it. 1940 to 50, there's a number of articles in magazines, newspapers, and so forth, that the Yampa Toponas was the lettuce and spinach producing center of the nation, they called it. Toponas was the largest spinach shipping point in the United States, 380 carloads of spinach in 1 year. There, again, a news article says that the Holden Produce Company at Topona shipped 1 million pounds of spinach to the Army during 42. I had myself, as I grew up with particularly spinach, lettuce, that's fine. But spinach, I could not tolerate eating spinach because at that time it was always cooked, canned, or whatever. The thought of eating spinach raw was not something that was even considered. So 1 million pounds of spinach. As far as the production of it is concerned, I need to, let's see. The lettuce was planted, lettuce and spinach both, crops were planted when the soil was ready, which was around the 1st of June every year. Spinach, being the fast-growing crop that it is, was ready to harvest by about the 1st of July. Head lettuce took longer, till about the 1st of August for the head lettuce. The lettuce, some of these details probably are, I'm just tossing them out to let you know. A pound of seed, of head lettuce seed, would plant 3 or 4 acres. It took 3 to 4 pounds of seed to plant an acre of spinach, so there was considerable difference there, price-wise also in terms of the seed. Lettuce was cut, well, I'm going to back up a little bit here. I have a trusty hoe with me. It doesn't have to be one that I was acquainted with when I was a teenager, but it was very much this type, about 7 inches across here. When one was hoeing lettuce, it was about 2 hoeing spaces between the plants that you left. Now, lettuce was planted in rows, much as the pictures and so forth that we have, and much as many of the produce crops are. And so it's a matter of going through every row with lettuce because you planted it and then it had to be thinned. It had to be thinned down in order for the big heads of lettuce to develop. The two hoe widths between the plants was about what you wanted to have. Likewise, then, it took less time, but a second time over was often needed to take out what they call the doubles. In other words, when you were going through, you tried to leave just single plants, but there were always some that were hard to determine, and so there were doubles in the field that had to be thinned or cut out also. Cultivating was done until about the mid-40s, was done with horses. My first experience when I was not yet a teenager in the lettuce and spinach field was riding a horse, pulling two-row cultivator with shafts on each side of the horse, and my father behind with the handlebars, I guess you'd call them, that controlled the cultivator. Many a mile cultivating the lettuce fields, and that was more or less typical of what machinery came about in a few more years to where the tractors were available. But the use of the horses or the horse-drawn cultivator was part of that era too. The lettuce, once it was ready to be harvested, the heads had to be mature, which meant that those who cut the lettuce went down through the field. They could tell pretty well on some of the heads, but they'd feel for that hard, firm head. I have with me 3 lettuce knives that were used in harvesting. 2 of them very similar, and this one just looks like something you'd scrape your grill maybe with. But that was feel the head, cut, and had to be sure to cut under to leave a little of the root on, or you would have a spoiled head of lettuce. And these things are the lettuce was then, whoever was cutting left it there in the field. Someone would come along then, and it was picked up and put into what we call field crates, the wooden crates that were used to carry the lettuce to the packing sheds. And from there it went through the packing process. At this point, before talking about the packing sheds, I'm going to go back to a little bit on the ice. One of the industries that was made possible by the ice houses being built in the area was the harvesting of the ice, which was done in usually after the first of the year. And that ice harvest contributed quite a little income at that time of year, at least, to the local farmers and ranchers, because it was a big business handling this ice harvest. And I have some pictures that you can look at later showing some of it, but again, horses were involved in the production of the commercial ice, at least in this area. And the place the horses fit into was that the ice had to be scraped off every time it snowed. The ice was scraped off with a team of horses. My father did that for a number of winters with the ice harvest. I have ice tongs down here to indicate the ice harvest, but I doubt that many of you have seen the corked horseshoes like this. And that was a purpose, was what the horses who were used on the ice to clear the snow. And the reason the snow was cleared off regularly was the snow provided insulation on top, and you wanted it to be as cold as possible for that ice to freeze as deep as it would in the temperatures that were. So the horses were shod with these cork shoes, which, again, horseshoeing, we don't have that done, still have that done. But one of the things that I remember specifically about this type of horseshoe on a horse was how dangerous they were. Often the inside plug was left off so that the horse didn't step on its other foot from the inside plug. What I remember distinctly is having horses, what they call corked, because they call these corks on the shoes. And having, this would have been during World War II that I'm remembering, but that was before the sulfas and the penicillins and the medications, and having many horses, several at least, that I can remember being hit by another horse, kicked by another horse, and having severe infections in their legs and the possibility of death from having been hit with the corks on their shoes. One of the things that I have here, which I value, is a label. I wish Susie had, and maybe she does somewhere in her family, have some of the Croner labels. This was the label of the Holden Produce Company, which was at Toponis. Mountain Air was one of the brands. Now, most packing houses had several brands that they, depending on who they were going to with the produce. The packing, another story I have, if you're not too tired of stories, that I have about the ice was that this Mr. Espy, of course, had his ice houses in Denver and also in Rollinsville and one here at Trappers. He would come up on the train at the time of the ice harvest to stay there, and stayed in the house with my family. And when he came, the train would stop at Trappers so he could get off there. And he always had one of these satchels with a handle on top that he carried around with him. And when he got on the train, he just tossed it up on the rack. And when it came time to pay the weekly pay to the men that were working on the ice, he would dump that out in the middle of our dining room table and say, "Wanda, come and help me." Would be full of cash. But he carried 1,000, several, I have no idea how much money, depending on what he thought he needed to pay his crew. And being the oldest one in my family, I was the one that was selected to help him be the banker. And we'd sit down and put together the cash in the envelope for each one of the workers at that time. So, some of you I know more about my family and members of the family, at least. The Espy property, where the ice houses were, and this is a little background on it, was actually a school section that Mr. Espy bought in 1924 from the state of Colorado, and that's where the ice houses were put. From 1940 until my father sold his ranch, which included considerable more acreage by that time, in 77, my father had a lease on that property there. And if you take time to look at some of these pictures later, you'll see that some of the greatest and best lettuce that was ever produced in South Routt was raised on this property that Mr. Espy had purchased. My father tried, through all the years that he leased that property, tried to buy it from the Espys. They would not sell. They would not sell. However, after the next buyer came along that leased the property, buyer of my father's ranch that leased the property, when he sold, which is about 10 years ago now, I knew the son of the original Espy, and one of my sons was able to acquire the property that the ice houses sat on. So now, as I've told several, I kind of have strange feelings when I drive by on the road that goes past this property, because I can remember it with those beautiful rows of lettuce, head lettuce, and look at it now as hay meadow. But I'm pleased that one in my family is still managing that particular piece of property. The other story I have about the ice has to do with the fact that the horses were used to pull the ice up to the whatever level they were on in terms of storing it in the ice houses. Horses were used to pull the cable that pulled they called it the Johnny boat behind the ice on up to the level to go into the ice houses. Those horses were unhitched at noon and watered at the time the men who were working had for lunch, and then given a little rest before they were hooked up again. We had a team of horses of big perch runs, black perch runs. I don't know that much about how much they weigh. They were just huge to me. They stood even taller than I am. And anyway, old Billy, as he was called, when he went to get a drink, he slipped and fell into the ice pond. Of course, this was in the middle of winter. It was a real struggle for the men that were there to get that horse out of the ice pond, which eventually, for sure how they did it, I can't tell you, but they did get him out, and then of course spent quite a bit of time rubbing him down in that cold temperature. But those are the kind of things that happen when you have animals. Other things happen when you have machinery, of course. That was one of the stories that I've always remembered, and especially having known that workhorse from driving him in the hayfield mowing hay. They're powerful horses. As far as the 1950 to 40 to 1950 era, this would be when there were the more modern packing sheds, electricity. Some of them, and I think Crowners were probably one of the earlier ones that had generators that they used in order to run the equipment that was beginning to be manufactured to use in the sheds. I think probably back in the 30s or even before that generators were being used in the sheds. In 1942, the Rural Electric Association put electricity through much of South Routt County, and as many people said, it was a real innovation for the packing sheds and certainly for the rural homes, as some of us know. The water was necessary for washing the produce, and that had to come from wells, and of course ice was needed. Labor during World War II came from local women or from transient groups that came through. There were truckload after truckload of people who came from Arkansas. That's the era that I know as far as labor was concerned. Families would come from for the summer. And living, housing, you talk about housing in the Steamboat area now, or anywhere in Routt County, I suppose you'd say. But housing then was minimum. It couldn't have passed any kind of inspections. But that's just the way people lived at that particular time, I guess. But I remember the families with various age children. During the summers of 47 and 48, I spent my summers home from college working in the Holden's office at Taponas. And in that office, one of my jobs was to write out the weekly paycheck for the various people who were working in the fields. We had a chart, depending on the age of the child, determine what they were paid. In other words, there would have been a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old. Usually there was 5-cent difference between. There might have been 25 cents for a 7 or 8-year-old child out there helping pick up the lettuce, or the man that was head of the crew, and often part of his crew was part of his family, would get $1 an hour for his work, which was considered good money at that time for that type of work. The other thing that I remember specifically from working in the office those 2 summers was that there was a teletype in the office, which to me is, looking back, kind of the beginning of the computer age, I guess, because we were able to take orders from Chicago, New York, wherever there was teletype connection, and then respond with when and what time and date the carload of lettuce or spinach was being sent to their particular destination. And sometimes those were destinations other than New York and Chicago that they ordered for. So the teletype was, I think, probably my first introduction to high tech in the real world, probably. When I say that, it made me think of something else I thought of as I was putting some of these notes together. Those long rows of lettuce that if you started out, you were thinning all the way down, and seeing how far that end of that row was away from you and all. Went on day after day doing that type of work. You've all seen workers in fields in other places that do hoeing, but it can be very monotonous, and particularly for teenagers, as some of us were at that time. We had a number of the neighbors' children who worked along with my sister and I in doing this kind of hoeing. We always talked about, well, when we grow up, where are we going to go? And of course, most of us had hardly been out of the Yampa area. I mean, Steamboat was like we're in Denver now, you know. And we'd talk about what we were going to do and how rich we were going to be, because money, even in that era, in that age, was like it is, I guess, now. But the dreaming and the things one had to think about to get to that end of the road. And then I guess one of the other pieces of equipment I have here, besides the hoe, which I've shown you, is the importance of a good sharpening file to keep your hoe sharp. Because if you kept it sharp, you could just move along. So get to the end of the road a little faster than if it wasn't doing so well. Once the produce was picked up in the field, whether it's spinach or lettuce, was hauled, and I think Crowners again were one of the initiators of using a big trailer to put the heads of lettuce into versus packing them in the field into crates to get them to the packing shed. Was that they first thing the produce did was went through washing, a type of shower business, to make sure that any of the loose soil was removed from it. And then it went to on a conveyor belts. All of these were conveyor belts or rollers that the crates rolled on. There were inspectors who pulled off leaves that were inferior or helped to get the lettuce turned in the right direction. The, at that point, after it had been cleared of any inferior leaves and was washed, it went on to those that were going to be packing it into crates. Hildred Fogg, who a lot of you do know from Yampa, our great historian there, has told me about her, and this would have been during her teenage years too, I'm sure, when she would ride the train from Steamboat to Yampa, work in the Crowner packing shed, ride the train back to Steamboat again. And there were a number of people who did that, right, Hildred? Who came to Yampa to do, in the summer, to do that type of work. One of the, once it was packed into the, and I wish I had, I'd even like to have one of those wooden crates, but I couldn't find one right now anyway. I'll come to that in a few minutes. The wooden crate then, once the heads were packed in, mostly it was 4 dozen heads was what they tried to put into a crate. Then, if they did have maybe the season affected it, the smaller heads, they could do as much as 5 dozen in a crate. At that point then, when the crate was filled, there was a special wide sheets of heavy waxed paper that were put on top of the produce, and then scoops of crushed ice on top, and then the lid. And the lid, it always amazed me how those lids could bow. It had to have been a special type of material that was wooden, yes, but they bowed across the top of those crates with that ice on it. Then it went on rollers on into the refrigerator cars where there were, I'm assuming all of them were big, strong men at least, men who were stacking the crates in the cars. And there were 318 crates of lettuce went into one of the cars, 640 of spinach, because spinach was packed in what they called half crates, smaller crates. But that was the process. Once the car was filled up to within a couple of feet of, I say a couple of feet, somewhere around that top, then the doors were closed, partially closed, and ice, crushed ice, was blown in on top of the carload of lettuce or spinach, so that it was iced well for some distance of traveling.
You have 5 minutes left.
I see that. In 1948, a man they called Pinky Williams came from Oxnard, California to the Tapones area, and he brought with him the California equipment and some men, to work in, and with that was the introduction of some of the, well, maybe more modern equipment, but it was used that summer somewhat in some of the larger fields, but the smaller fields were just too small for the California type approach. I know that at that time about is when Crowners were began doing the, using the cardboard carton, and some of you may have seen this already, but this has on it the vacuum-cooled Colorado spinach. The vacuum cooling was a new process that they did in their new, well, it was built in 45, I believe, lettuce packing shed at Yampa. And this, they used a refrigerated vacuum, and what they were doing was pulling cold air through the crates to cool quickly down to a cooler temperature. And we need more information about how that worked. But anyway, at the same time, Holden from Tapones started doing some of the cellophane pack, small cellophane pack of spinach. Spinach previously had always been cut with the root, but when it got to the shed for these packages, much as some of the spinach we can buy today, it was packed into cut so it was just leaves that were being put into the pack. So those were some of the newer things that came along about the time at the end of the harvest season, or the produce season in South Routt developed. Some of it went on for a little longer, but because of the California was the main competitor. They had longer growing season. They had easier access to their markets because they were right there. And they had available labor, which became even more of a problem in this area. So, again, anyone who knows me knows that I can talk forever, but I am going to stop. I'm going to say that if you've all seen the classic picture of the farmer with his bundles of grain and his pitchfork, well, remember me with my